Omniscience and the Preservation of Free Will, a brief consideration of the foreknowledge of God with the application of the multi-world interpretation. Presented July 14th, 2014. I'll go to the store tomorrow. One recognizes this as a very simple sentence, yet there is an unspoken understanding associated with the thought, provided. Humans can know what was and what is, but the future can only be spoken of in possibilities, probabilities, and potential. The simple reason lies in the fact that humans cannot know the future events with 100% assurance. God, on the other hand, exists as a being not affected by the rigors and uncertainties of time. All is open to the eye of God, past, present, and future. In the Scriptures, God is described as being in all places simultaneously. Proverbs 15:3. Having a knowledge of the thoughts of men, Isaiah 66:18. Possessing a foreknowledge of those events that will come to pass in the future, Isaiah 48:3-5, and even those events that would be considered future conditional, Jeremiah 38:17 and 18. In short, God is omniscient, which raises certain questions. Since God is omniscient and knows all that has, is, and will happen, how can mankind have free will? If God knows that something will happen, and God, because of his nature, having a perfect knowledge of all events, how can a person do anything other than what God knows will be done? Therefore, the question becomes, how can the Creator have a perfect knowledge of all future events while the created still maintains the free will to choose one course of action over another? That, of course, is one of the difficulties with a question such as the one above. What really constitutes free will? It might be helpful at this point to describe two situations that involve freedom of choice. When someone takes a headlong dive off a cliff without adequate means to overcome gravity, the outcome is fixed. This example shows that once a person subjects themselves to the natural laws of the physical universe, those laws will assume and assure the outcome unless in some way altered, i.e., no freedom of choice. Now consider the same person standing at the precipice before the plunge with the internal argument of whether or not to jump. Up to the point the feet leave the ground, the person has the choice to act or to not act, freedom of choice. Therefore, a simple definition of free will is an individual having the control to select one option over another unless the choice is nullified by an external force. In fairness, it should be noted at this point that there are those who take the so what position when considering the foreknowledge of God. The basic thrust of this position manifests itself in two ways: those that do not take the idea of God seriously, and those that see the inevitableness regarding our choices, which therefore renders our control meaningless. Although turning our free will over to this particular type of fatalism could have a certain appeal, let us progress forward and consider how God may experience the future and preserve the free will of mankind. The future of the human experience is never completely known by humans. The now of our existence is comprised of what has happened and a future that, for the most part, is an unknown. God, on the other hand, lives in a continuous presence which encompasses human past, present, and future. Boethius postulated what may be called a perceptual model of God's knowledge. Foreknowledge is a simple awareness of the future, not having any complex deductive or inductive reasoning. What God knows of the past, present, and future is merely a result of having produced all that is. Once the world and the time we move through were formed, knowledge of what has, is, and will happen also simultaneously coalesced in the mind of God. Some question Boethius' position by asking how an all-knowing God that does not change could encounter new knowledge. But the answer is presented that since God is outside of time, his creative activity is not temporarily known to his foreknowledge. The solution presented by Boethius is elegant, but the free will of mankind remains secondary, since the coalesced knowledge of God demands all human actions be known prior to their occurrence. When considering the idea of complete foreknowledge, one must consider the theological ideals of John Calvin, whose Institutes of Theology, published in 1536, became the standards of Protestant doctrine. The basis of complete foreknowledge for Calvin stems from the understanding that God is in control of the unfolding of time, including all events that would be considered future events. Because God has predetermined the totality of events in human history, the issue of free will becomes secondary and a consideration to the truthfulness of God's foreknowledge. This leads some to label Calvinism as fatalistic and a form of theology. A relative contemporary of Calvin was the theologian Jacobus Arminius, and those that followed his teaching in the Dutch Reformed Church. Arminius saw that within the Scriptures an argument for the individual to determine their eternal destination, thus making free will of primary importance. The opposite of Calvin's unconditional election was Arminius's conditional election, making mankind the ultimate decisive force, exercising a libertine free will. One possible method to describe this libertine free will is a consideration made by Hall, who acknowledges that God knows all that is, but indicates that the future is not. Since God knows everything that is, he cannot know the future, and so the future remains open and man retains his freedom. Finally, but certainly not exhaustively, one may consider the 16th century Jesuit theologian Louis de Molina, who contributed the idea of middle knowledge to the discussion. The basic premise of middle knowledge is that God, using his knowledge of potential outcomes, human behavior, and natural law, actualized a specific world to produce specific results for the created. Christian apologist Dick Stanzo summarized this position well when he noted the possibility that God may have created, brought about a world that best utilizes human free choices to accomplish his purpose in history. Two considerations should be noted from the previous positions. First, the common assumption of a linear time construction, or all actions must occur because those actions will have occurred in the future in a specific order. This assumption speaks to the understanding that what God knows about the future is true, and since God knows an action is true, that action must occur. Second, the influence exerted by such theologians as Calvin, Arminius, and Molina regarding foreknowledge and free will have their roots in 16th and 17th century thought. Along with other advances in science and philosophy during the last 400 years have been advancements in mankind's theoretical understanding of time. Hugh Everett is credited with the advancing a theory in 1954 that led to the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which states that everything that could possibly have happened in our past, but did not, has occurred in the past in some other universe or universes. Applying the multi-world interpretation to our elementary understanding of time, we could ask, do we vitiate the omniscience of God by restricting his knowledge to the outcome of our existence to a single possibility? The two factors of free will and omniscience seem to be in opposition, since free will is determined by the ability to choose any potential outcome, and the omniscience of God demands that the timeline for each and every person must be known by that infinite Spirit, including all future events. Therefore, to harmonize the difference between free will and omniscience, one speculates that God must know all potential outcomes that accompany all the freely chosen actions by all persons at all times. In other words, what humans understand as counterfactuals, secondary to our linear understanding of time, God knows as factuals. Let us consider the basic premise for a moment. Mr. X leaves his home and begins the rather mundane drive to work. At the intersection of Avenue Y and 32nd Street, Mr. X can make a choice to either go left or go right. Neither option adds or subtracts any significant time to the route. The theory behind multiple world interpretation tells us that whichever option Mr. X takes, another version of Mr. X takes the opposite route, creating two equally real timelines. Applying the same thought to the knowledge of God, one is able to envision God at the intersection with Mr. X, but knowing all the potential occurrences that accompany either direction because of omniscience. The difference is that Mr. X, having opted one direction over the other, can only experience the events that occurred on the other route as possible unrealized counterfactuals. God, on the other hand, knows without a doubt the totality of events that accompanied both routes, and knows those events with equal truthfulness. From the Scriptures, we can consider the pericope found in 2 Samuel 24 and the parallel passage from 1 Chronicles 21, when King David numbers the people. In the story, the anger of God was aroused against Israel to such an extent that David realized his mistake and seeks forgiveness. The prophet Gad is sent with three options, one of which will serve as the punishment against David. A famine will strike the land, David will be pursued by his enemies for 3 months, or a plague will strike the land for 3 days. This is recording in 2 Samuel 24:11 through 13, and 1 Chronicles 21:9 through 12. It is at this point that King David deliberates which future potential consequence will result. By applying a theology that supports complete determination secondary to the foreknowledge of God, one is left with the understanding that since God already knew which option David would choose, the presentation of the three options was merely for appearance. The pendulum then swings to open theism, where God does not know the final choice, since the future is yet to be determined. By applying the multiple world interpretation, not to David's choice, but to God's omniscience, we understand that God already knows all the variables that will result because of the choice made by David. God knows the totality of every chain of events that accompanies any decision before a person commits to any specific course of action. Because the individual is constrained by existence in time, alternative timelines can only be expressed as potentials. Contrawise, God is not constrained by time and can experience every timeline as factual. The concrete existence of a specific timeline is therefore controlled by the individual's choice, not the fact that God knows a specific timeline must occur. The implication for viewing the knowledge of God from this perspective touches the three primary methods of understanding divine foreknowledge previously discussed. From the perspective of the Calvinist, God knows the final destination of each person as a factual outcome, which may be viewed as fatalistic. The result of understanding that God can know multiple timelines as factual frees the Calvinist from the fatalistic outcome of forcing God into a single factual outcome for mortal existence. This maintains the complete omniscience of the Creator while also allowing the free will of the created. Arminians view the individual as having free will to choose the eternal outcome of their lives, which, when carried to a logical conclusion, points to a libertarian model of free will in human behavior. The ultimate result of complete human free will leads one toward a conclusion of open theism and not complete omniscience for the divine. Yet, this can be overcome with a multiple timeline view of God's knowledge. The result of complete free will by the created forces the future to become an unknown, but that only applies when viewing time as a single thread. God is able to view all the individual threads of time with equal truthfulness. Monism, which places the individual into a predetermined existence to produce God's desired results, becomes obsolete. The knowledge of God can be extended beyond a universe designed to funnel mankind like cattle into a chute of a specific, albeit benevolent, outcome. By truncating our understanding of God's knowledge of future events to models devised in the 16th and 17th century, we in essence place a humanly devised restriction upon the omniscience of God. Applying the theoretical framework of multiple timelines to the knowledge of God allows our finite minds to appreciate that God has the latitude to know the truthfulness of more than one possible outcome for any specific human behavior and the results of that behavior. The free will of mankind is then maintained within and supported because of the omniscience of God.